June 22, 1944. 0440 hours. Northern Ardennes Forest. The fog had rolled in before midnight and settled into the valleys like a living thing. It swallowed sound. It twisted outlines. It erased distances. Even veteran scouts struggled to judge direction in the thick gray curtain. Light bled into the haze and scattered in every direction. The Germans used this confusion to move patrols with near impunity. Allied units lost contact with each other. Platoons drifted off planned routes. A man could hear footfalls 20 meters away, yet have no sense of where they came from. Several patrols fired at shadows and hit friendly soldiers. Officers called the conditions the most dangerous fog seen in the Ardennes since the start of the campaign. Sergeant Elias Thorne crouched beside a lichen-covered beech tree and listened to the distant sound of water dripping from the canopy. He had the broad shoulders and quiet posture of a man used to long days of physical labor. His face was weathered. His eyes were steady. Before the war he had worked as a lumberjack and forest guide in the Pacific Northwest. He had spent 20 years navigating cedar groves, Douglas fir stands, and shaded logging trails. He knew how fog behaved when it moved across valleys. He understood how moisture clung to bark and changed its color. The forest spoke to him in cues others missed. He could track a trail in near darkness by reading the slight tilt of branches or the shifting pressure of cold air. His platoon had been assigned to secure a series of elevated ridges that overlooked German positions. The ridges were steep. The paths were narrow. The fog turned every turn into a blind corner. A soldier could walk 3 meters off the main trail and vanish. Radio communication failed constantly. Reports of friendly fire increased each night. One squad lost 2 men when they stepped into a clearing and mistook an American patrol for a German advance team. The fog created a battlefield where doctrine failed. Map reading required line of sight. Compass bearings meant little when trails curved through dense undergrowth. High command insisted on maintaining patrols, but every man understood the risk. The forest punished mistakes. Thorne watched 2 scouts from 1st Squad disappear into the gray wall. Their silhouettes dissolved after a dozen steps. The lieutenant whispered that they would take the south ridge and signal back when they reached the first marker point. Thorne knew no signal would reach them. The fog scattered light. A flashlight beam spread into a pale smear. Sound traveled unpredictably. A shouted message could curve through the trees and seem to come from the wrong direction. Patrols needed a system that worked inside this environment. A system that did not rely on bright light or noise. A system that left a trace only friendly soldiers understood. Thorne studied the trunk of a birch tree beside him. The outer bark was papery and white. He touched a small tear near a broken branch and peeled back a narrow strip. The inner surface was smooth. Moisture from the fog collected on it. When he angled it slightly, the strip caught a faint glimmer of ambient light. It was not bright. It was not visible from any distance. Yet at the right angle, for a brief moment, it created a tiny glint. Thorne narrowed his eyes. He peeled another strip. He examined how the sheen changed when he turned it. He leaned closer. The damp inner layer reflected light in a thin, controlled flash. Memories from his lumberjack years rose in his mind. He remembered how a freshly cut wedge from a cedar trunk would catch stray morning light even under thick clouds. He remembered how loggers used subtle reflections on wet bark to judge direction during storms. He had worked with old mountain guides who read forests like books. They taught him to watch for micro-reflections on sap lines, to follow the faint shimmer on carved tree surfaces, and to interpret moisture patterns in fog. These skills had no place in standard military manuals. They belonged to a world where men survived by reading forests instead of maps. Thorne stepped back from the tree and considered the possibilities. If he placed thin bark strips at specific angles along a trail, they would produce a brief glint when illuminated with a tight beam of filtered light. Not a wide beam. Not a bare flashlight. Something narrower. Something barely visible to the enemy. A simple cloth wrap over the lens would reduce the brightness and limit the spread. Soldiers could sweep the trail with a faint light and detect the glint rather than the tree itself. It would require no metal, no special equipment, and no visible markings. Only bark. Only the forest itself. He moved to another tree and peeled more strips. Different species produced different inner surfaces. Oak bark absorbed moisture but created a dull surface. Beech bark offered a faint sheen. Birch bark produced a stronger reflection when stripped fresh. He took several samples and held them at a consistent angle against the small cone of filtered light from his modified flashlight. The glint appeared for a fraction of a second. Not bright enough to reveal a position, but distinct enough for someone who knew exactly what to look for. He repeated the test with several angles. He found the optimal tilt. Slightly downward. Slightly facing the direction of movement. Enough to reflect but not enough to shine outward. The idea began to form into a method. Soldiers could mark routes by attaching narrow bark strips at predetermined intervals. Each strip would serve as a position confirmation point. If a patrol swept the beam and saw the glint, they knew they were on the correct path. If they did not see it, they had drifted. They could turn, adjust, and continue until the glint reappeared. No noise. No signals. No visible markers. A hidden trail known only to the unit that set it. Thorne tested the strips along a 10-meter section of forest path. He paced out equal distances and placed each strip at the correct angle. He moved back, exhaled slowly, and activated the filtered beam. The first strip responded with a faint shimmer. He continued moving. The next strip glinted. He advanced through the fog and found each marker without stepping off the trail. The method worked. Crude. Simple. Effective. He returned to the platoon area and requested a word with Lieutenant Harlow. The lieutenant listened with skeptical patience. Thorne explained the concept. He demonstrated the filtered beam. He showed the bark samples. Harlow raised questions about reliability, enemy detection, and long-term durability. Thorne answered each question with calm precision. He described how the natural moisture would maintain the reflectivity. He explained how the narrow beam would prevent visibility from any meaningful distance. He offered to run a controlled test in real conditions. Harlow agreed. A trial would begin before dawn. The fog thickened as the platoon assembled for the trial. Men stood in a loose semicircle with rifles slung and collars pulled tight against the damp air. The sky remained a uniform gray. The forest absorbed light and returned nothing. Lieutenant Harlow placed 2 scouts at the far end of the designated trail. Their task was simple. Walk the path. Follow the markers. Report if they drifted. Thorne watched them take position with quiet confidence. They were good men, but they had struggled in these conditions like everyone else. Fog respected no rank or experience. Thorne moved to the first marker tree and adjusted the bark strip with a practiced hand. The curve of the strip, the angle of the fiber grain, and the tilt relative to the slope all influenced the reflective point. The fog coated the bark with a thin layer of moisture. He waited for the water to settle. He stepped back and used his filtered beam to test it. The glint appeared for a split second, faint but unmistakable. A flash that vanished as quickly as it arrived. It was enough. Harlow signaled the scouts to begin. They moved into the haze, swallowed within 3 steps. The platoon listened. Only the soft sound of boots on wet soil remained. Thorne waited for the first glint to be detected. A soft whisper came from the fog. The scouts acknowledged the marker. They continued. Second marker confirmed. Third marker confirmed. No drift. No confusion. Harlow nodded, surprised despite himself. Thorne kept his focus on the fog. He wanted consistent verification. A single success meant little. A system needed reliability. The scouts continued the route. Every few seconds, a quiet whisper reached the platoon. Each whisper meant another glint located. Another marker passed. Another stretch of trail navigated without deviation. The scouts returned 10 minutes later. Their faces told the story before they spoke. They had followed the path without error. One scout tapped the bark strip Thorne had left at the final bend. He said it felt like the forest itself was guiding them. Word spread fast. Men who had spent weeks stumbling through fog now felt hope. They asked Thorne questions. How far apart could the strips be placed? Which trees worked best? How many could be set in a single night? Thorne answered each question with measured clarity. Birch was best for short-term use. Beech worked for longer durations. Oak was too dull. Strips should be placed every 20 meters on straight paths, 10 meters on curves. Angles mattered. If placed too steeply, the strip absorbed light. If placed too flat, it scattered. Precision created consistency. Harlow authorized a full deployment for the next reconnaissance mission. A 3-man patrol would attempt a night approach on a German listening post located near a stream. The terrain required tight navigation. One misstep could reveal their presence. Thorne volunteered to accompany the patrol. His knowledge would ensure correct placement of the strips. The lieutenant approved. They set out before midnight. The forest seemed even darker than before. The air hung thick and cold. Fog collected on helmets and dripped from rifle barrels. Thorne carried a small pouch filled with strips he had prepared earlier. He tore fresh pieces from select trees along the way. Each strip had a unique sheen pattern. He knew how to match the reflection strength with the distance required. At the first bend in the trail, Thorn knelt and attached the initial marker. He lightly scraped the edge of the strip to expose a brighter inner layer. He set it at the correct tilt and tested it. Satisfied, he motioned for the patrol to move. The men advanced cautiously. Thorn stayed near the rear. His eyes scanned the trees, noting how the fog shifted around trunks and branches. Even without markers, he could read forest currents like water patterns in a stream. The patrol reached the second ridge. They placed another marker. Thorn adjusted it after a brief test. The glint was too faint. The moisture on the bark had thickened. He scraped a narrower line through the inner fibers. The reflection improved. The men moved on. On a narrow slope overlooking the stream, they heard German voices drifting through the haze. The fog changed direction with a slight shift in wind. Sound traveled in unpredictable arcs. The patrol froze. Thorn listened carefully. The voices seemed close, but the echoes might have carried them uphill. He held his breath. He examined the faint shapes in the distance. Nothing moved. After a full minute, he signaled them to continue. They reached the final observation point and recorded enemy movements. The listening post had 6 men, not 3 as earlier reports suggested. 2 carried rifles. 1 carried a flare gun. The patrol noted these details. They prepared to withdraw. Navigation on return was always harder. Fatigue made men drift. Nerves caused hesitation. Thorn relied on the markers. He tested each one before stepping past it. The filtered beam found each glint exactly where he placed it. The patrol returned without alerting the enemy. When they reached the platoon area, Harlow listened to the entire report. He asked specifically about the markers. The patrol leader said they worked flawlessly. Thorn nodded quietly. He explained how fog interacted with surface moisture and why certain trees produced more consistent reflections. Harlow asked how widely the technique could be used. Thorn estimated that any unit operating in similar forests could implement it within hours. All they needed were basic instructions and a steady hand. The next morning, several squads requested training. Thorn began with fundamentals. He taught them how to identify suitable trees. He showed them how to peel strips properly. He demonstrated the correct angle of placement. Soldiers took notes on ammunition boxes and canteen covers. They practiced with their own flashlights. Many failed at first. Their beams were too bright or too wide. Thorn corrected them patiently. Wrap more cloth around the lens. Angle the wrist downward. Move the beam slower across the surface. After an hour, most troops could spot the glint on command. By sunset, the entire company had adopted the method. The next major test came 2 nights later. A coordinated movement across 2 ridge lines depended on precise synchronization. 3 patrols needed to reach separate observation points at the same time. The fog was thicker than usual. Some men hesitated. Harlow ordered Thorn to oversee the marker placement. Thorn worked for 3 hours, moving silently from tree to tree, creating a complete network of glint points across the forest floor. Each patrol set out along a different route. If any patrol drifted, the entire operation would fail. Thorn waited near the central ridge with the filtered beam in hand. He tested each critical marker as patrols approached their routes. They reported steady progress. Every marker glinted. No drift occurred. For the first time in weeks, all 3 patrols completed their routes simultaneously. Morale surged. The success of the coordinated movement changed how the battalion viewed night operations in fog. Units that once avoided deep reconnaissance now volunteered for them. Officers who had doubted the practicality of Thorn's method requested detailed briefings. The system had proven itself under pressure. It reduced the fear that had crippled patrols for weeks. Soldiers walked with more certainty. They trusted the glint markers to keep them aligned with the intended route. Still, Thorn stressed caution. He reminded the men that the forest changed quickly. Moisture levels shifted. Bark texture varied. Angles needed constant attention. A single poorly placed strip could mislead an entire patrol. He inspected every marker set by new trainees, correcting their work with quiet precision. He knew that reliability depended on discipline. Nature rewarded careful observation. It punished carelessness. Lieutenant Harlow recognized that the glint test had potential beyond simple navigation. He met with Thorn one evening as fog gathered at the tree line. He asked whether the same reflectivity principles could be used to track enemy movements. Thorn considered the idea. In theory, a network of glint points could serve as detection markers. If an enemy patrol crossed a certain point, it might disturb a strip or alter its angle. A broken or shifted marker could indicate intrusion. The forest could reveal what footprints could not. Harlow approved a trial. Thorne selected a narrow choke point near a stream. Only one viable path crossed the ravine. Germans often used it to move small squads between positions. Thorne placed several bark strips in precise alignment. He made sure each one faced slightly toward the approach angle. A disturbance would change the direction of the reflection. A careful observer could detect this change with a simple sweep of the beam. 2 days later, the system delivered its first result. During a routine scan, a scout noticed that one of the strips was misaligned. Thorne examined it. The fibers along the top edge showed slight compression. The strip had been brushed by equipment or clothing. The Germans had passed through recently. The platoon prepared for contact. They moved into cover and waited. Less than an hour later, a German patrol entered the ravine. The platoon engaged from high ground. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes. The Germans withdrew, leaving 2 dead. The ambush would not have been possible without the detection marker. Harlow told the company commander that the method allowed them to read enemy movement as if the forest itself had spoken. Thorne's quiet innovation spread through whispers. Nearby units requested instruction. Thorne visited their positions and delivered training sessions. Some soldiers initially mocked the idea of using tree bark as a tactical system. After the first demonstration, their tone changed. They realized that the forest offered tools they had never considered. Thorne helped them adapt the method to different trees. He explained how moisture patterns varied by elevation. He showed them how to compensate for wind drift by adjusting the tilt of the strip. By early July, entire companies operated reliably in fog using Thorne's markers. Friendly fire incidents decreased sharply. Lost patrols became rare. Reconnaissance reports grew more accurate. The battalion commander issued a commendation to Thorne, though he downplayed it with the same reserved humility he carried throughout his career. The fog returned with renewed intensity during the second week of July. For 2 nights, visibility dropped to less than 5 meters. German units attempted to exploit the conditions. They moved probing patrols along the ridges. They hoped to catch American squads off guard. Thorne anticipated this. He placed triple marker lines at several approach points. Each line used strips from different trees. The subtle differences in reflectivity created a layered detection system. If any line changed, the pattern would reveal the direction and number of enemy soldiers. Just after midnight, a scout returned to Thorne with urgent news. One of the triple marker lines had shifted. Not 1 strip, but 3. Thorne followed the scout to the location. The fog felt heavier than usual. The forest was silent. Thorne inspected the strips. The angle of displacement indicated movement from the southeast. The disturbance pattern suggested at least 5 men. The Germans were moving cautiously. They had tried to avoid contact. Thorne reported to Harlow. The lieutenant organized an intercept team. They moved silently along the ridge. Every step was deliberate. Every breath controlled. Thorne led them using his glint markers as reference points. The forest gave no natural light. The markers were the only reliable guide. After 15 minutes, the team reached a point overlooking a narrow saddle. They waited. Shapes emerged through the gray curtain. 5 German soldiers moved in single file. Their outlines blurred by fog. Thorne signaled the team to hold fire. He wanted confirmation of direction. He used the filtered beam and checked the nearest detection strip. It had shifted further since last inspection. The Germans were moving through the exact path predicted. Thorne gave the signal. The ambush was precise. Short controlled bursts. No wasted rounds. The survivors fled downhill. The intercept team maintained discipline and avoided pursuit. The operation succeeded with minimal risk. Harlow credited the result entirely to the glint system. Thorne said only that the forest left signs for anyone who cared to read them. 3 days later, the battalion prepared for a larger movement across multiple ridges. The mission required wide coordination between several companies. Commanders feared the fog would cripple their timing. Thorne met with senior officers and presented a full mapping of marker placements. He explained the sequence of reflective points. He assigned each company its own marker code to avoid confusion. A single misread reflection could send a unit in the wrong direction, so he introduced a method of double confirmation. Soldiers would check the angle of 2 consecutive markers before advancing. The officers studied the system. Most had never seen such integration of natural materials into tactical planning. Thorne spoke with quiet authority. He explained how fresh bark aged over time. He detailed how the reflective layer changed with moisture. He offered backup placement patterns in case the fog intensified beyond expected density. The battalion commander approved the plan. At sunset, Thorne and 2 assistants moved along the trails. They worked quickly but precisely. They measured angles, tested each strip, and marked secondary routes with faint lines on the inner bark to indicate direction. Every marker contributed to a network that spanned more than 2 kilometers of forest terrain. By midnight, all markers were in place. Company commanders double-checked their assigned paths. Scouts verified the glint points. Thorne inspected every critical segment. He knew the mission depended on a flawless system. The fog thickened again, settling into every fold of the landscape. At 0130 hours, the battalion began to move. The forest swallowed them, yet not a single unit drifted. The glint system guided all 4 companies through dense fog that would have halted operations weeks earlier. The battalion advanced deeper into the forest with confidence that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. Thorne walked near the rear of the lead company, checking each marker as they passed. Every glint appeared exactly as expected. The filtered beams cut through the fog in narrow shafts. The markers responded with faint, disciplined reflections. Not too bright. Not scattered. Just enough to deliver confirmation without exposing movement. By 0300 hours, the units reached their assigned ridges. Communication teams established links between positions. The fog muted the sound of distant artillery. The battalion command post received synchronized reports from every patrol. The success of the movement impressed the officers. It showed that controlled navigation in near-zero visibility was possible without advanced equipment. At dawn, German forces attempted a probing attack on the eastern slope. They advanced under the same fog that had once hampered Allied patrols. This time the Americans held the advantage. Thorne's system allowed squads to navigate between firing positions with precision. Machine gun teams shifted along pre-marked glint paths to reinforce weak spots. Riflemen advanced and fell back as if they could see the terrain clearly. The Germans grew confused. They fired into empty spaces. They retreated after realizing the Americans moved with uncanny coordination. The battalion suffered minimal casualties. Officers credited the victory to discipline and preparedness. Soldiers credited the quiet lumberjack who had taught them how to read the forest. As the success spread through the regiment, more units requested Thorne's guidance. He traveled between companies and demonstrated the technique again and again. Some soldiers struggled with the concept of diffuse reflection. Others worried about consistency in varying moisture levels. Thorne explained each component with the patience of a skilled mentor. He taught them how to adjust the angle of the beam, how to judge bark density, and how to test glints before committing to a route. His instruction was detailed. He showed men how to detect failures before they occurred. If a strip absorbed too much moisture, the reflection weakened. If the inner bark dried too quickly, it lost its sheen. Thorne taught them how to scrape a second layer to reactivate the reflective quality. He taught them how to avoid placing markers near sap pockets that distorted the light. The soldiers learned that the method was not simply about bark. It was about understanding the forest as a living environment. By mid-July, the glint test had become a common feature of night operations. Units began adapting it creatively. One platoon developed a 2-strip signal system for silent communication. 2 glints meant halt. 1 glint meant proceed. Another squad used glint markers to guide casualty evacuation teams through fog-filled ravines. Medics relied on the faint reflections to navigate without losing wounded soldiers. Thorne encouraged these adaptations, though he warned that complexity invited risk. Simple systems survived battlefield stress. Complicated ones failed under pressure. He advised units to maintain clear rules and consistent placement. He insisted that every marker be tested by multiple soldiers before a mission. On July 17, a new challenge emerged. Heavy rain soaked the forest for 12 straight hours. The moisture level rose to the point where inner bark fibers swelled. Several strips turned too dark to reflect properly. A patrol returning from a reconnaissance mission reported difficulty spotting markers. Harlow ordered Thorne to assess the damage. Thorne moved through the forest with his filtered beam. He examined each strip carefully. Many had absorbed significant water. Their reflective surfaces had become dull. Thorne scraped a few to test the second layer. Some regained their sheen. Others remained too dark. The system needed adjustment. Thorne gathered a team of soldiers and explained the problem. Rain had increased fiber saturation beyond the optimal range. Reflectivity dropped. The solution was to shift to species with denser inner surfaces. Birch would remain useful. Beech would remain stable. Oak, despite its dullness, could retain a narrow strip of reflectivity when carved deeper. Thorne demonstrated the deeper cut. The inner fibers revealed a thin line of reflection. Not as strong as birch but consistent. He reorganized the marker set for the entire ridge network. Soldiers worked for hours replacing and relocating strips. They adjusted angles to accommodate the heavier fog created by the rainfall. Thorne explained how saturated air changed the trajectory of the beam. He taught them to aim slightly lower to compensate. By nightfall, the system was functional again. That same night, German forces launched a coordinated infiltration attempt. They hoped to exploit the weather and slip through the Allied lines. The fog thickened to its highest density since early June. Visibility dropped to less than 2 meters. German patrols moved silently through the trees, confident that the Americans would be lost in the conditions. They were wrong. Every glint marker functioned. Every angle delivered its faint flash. American squads intercepted German patrols in multiple sectors. Detection markers revealed movement patterns with surprising accuracy. The American positions remained organized. The German patrols became disoriented. When dawn arrived, several enemy bodies were found near marker lines, evidence of silent nighttime engagements. The battalion commander summoned Thorne to his tent. He asked for a full explanation of how the system survived the heavy rainfall. Thorne described the adjustments. He spoke about fiber density, moisture retention rates, and the physics of diffuse reflection. The commander listened with quiet respect. He realized that the success of the battalion in fog-ridden terrain rested on the shoulders of one man with a background in lumber and wilderness navigation. He asked Thorne if the system could scale further. Thorne said yes, but with limits. The forest provided the raw materials. Soldiers provided the discipline. Training ensured reliability. Expansion to different terrains would require new adaptations, since bark properties differed by region. The commander nodded. He understood the implications. 2 days later, higher command learned of the method. They sent a staff officer to observe. He followed Thorne through the forest and watched the training firsthand. He saw how soldiers moved confidently through thick fog using the faint glints as guides. He wrote a report describing the method as a field innovation of unusual effectiveness. The report circulated through multiple divisions. Despite growing recognition, Thorne avoided attention. He cared only for the safety of the men who walked the trails each night. The fog persisted throughout July, and the method continued to evolve. Patrols improved their placement. Scouts refined their detection techniques. Medics used glint lines to reach wounded soldiers with unprecedented speed. Artillery observers marked fallback routes with reflective sequences. Small adjustments made the system smoother. Soldiers discovered that dried birch strips regained reflectivity when redampened. Thorne taught them how to store backup strips under their jackets to keep moisture levels stable. He emphasized consistency. He repeated his core rule. The forest speaks only if you listen carefully. His men listened. By late July, the Glint Test had transformed the battalion's entire operational rhythm. Patrols scheduled for night movement no longer hesitated when fog warnings came down from higher command. Instead, soldiers gathered their gear, checked their filtered beams, inspected their bark strips, and moved into the forest with a calm confidence that surprised even veteran officers. Thorne remained the system's anchor. He reviewed every mission plan. He walked each major route before operations began. He checked moisture levels, tested reflectivity, and ensured that soldiers placed markers at the correct angle. His quiet leadership earned respect from men who rarely trusted anything outside standard doctrine. They knew his system worked. They had survived because of it. The next major test came on the night of July 26. Intelligence suggested that German patrols had begun memorizing common American approach routes. They avoided certain ridges, set traps along predictable paths, and laid ambushes where they expected scouts to travel. Harlow called an emergency planning session. He and Thorne studied the map under a dim lantern. They knew they had to create new routes, ones the enemy would not anticipate. Thorne proposed a complex adjustment. Instead of marking a single main trail, they would create a branching glint network. 3 separate routes would split from the initial path before converging again near the final objective. Only one branch would be used by the main patrol. The other 2 would serve as decoys. If Germans tracked American movement or attempted to intercept, they would follow false routes into dead ground. Harlow agreed. The tactic required precise placement. Each branch needed distinctive glint characteristics so the patrol could identify the correct one. Thorne demonstrated how to alter reflective patterns by scraping thin vertical lines, creating slight curvature, or adjusting fiber exposure. Soldiers memorized the codes. One short glint indicated the primary path. A longer, stretched glint identified the decoy. Another showed a double reflection pattern produced by a paired strip. Thorne and a small team constructed the branching network over 4 hours. They worked in near silence, moving through fog thick as cloth. Every strip mattered. Every angle mattered. Mist variation changed the sheen of the bark. Thorne checked it relentlessly, making micro adjustments until each marker produced the intended signal. The patrol left at 2,315 hours. They reached the first fork. The decoy markers produced faint patterns that looked convincing to the untrained eye. Only the patrol leader, trained by Thorne, recognized which reflection matched the primary code. They advanced along the correct route. German patrols moved on the flanks but never saw the Americans. They walked into the decoys instead, believing they were tracking real movement. The Americans reached their objective, observed enemy positions, and returned without a single casualty. The success confirmed the Glint system's adaptability. It could deceive as well as guide. It could mislead the enemy while protecting friendly troops. Officers began calling it a silent compass. During the first week of August, the battalion prepared for a larger regional push. Commanders needed detailed reconnaissance of multiple German defensive positions. Fog again covered the forest each night. Thorne met with reconnaissance leaders and laid out a full network of glint markers covering more than 3 kilometers. It was the largest deployment of his system to date. He assigned specific marker codes to each patrol. He instructed them to memorize not just their own reflective patterns, but also the position of detection markers placed in likely infiltration routes. He reminded them to expect environmental shifts. Fog density changed reflectivity hour by hour. Moisture levels altered the glint strength. Soldiers practiced adjusting their beams to compensate. That night, 8 reconnaissance teams moved through the forest simultaneously. The fog was nearly impenetrable. Visibility dropped to less than a meter. Without the markers, the battalion would have called off the operation. Thorne's network guided the patrols with precision. Each team followed its coded path. Each glint confirmed direction. Every detection marker along the enemy approach routes remained stable. The forest felt alive with faint flashes only the trained eye could see. At 0200 hours, one team encountered trouble. A detection marker near the western ravine had shifted. Thorne arrived at the location within minutes. He examined the strip. The fibers were bent at an angle that signaled a deliberate disturbance. German boots had brushed it. He followed the next marker. It too had shifted. Thorne realized an enemy patrol had crossed into the American operational zone. He guided a squad through the glint network to intercept. The fog was thick but the markers held the path. They moved swiftly and silently. The Germans appeared as faint shapes barely visible through the haze. The Americans struck without warning. The fight lasted only seconds. The squad recovered valuable intelligence from the enemy. The detection markers had prevented a surprise attack. The next day the battalion commander summoned Thorne again. This time he brought a major from division headquarters. The major asked Thorne to explain the system in detail. Thorne spoke clearly and concisely. He outlined every component. He described moisture behavior, fiber structure, beam control, and terrain adaptation. He explained how different trees produce different reflective qualities. He detailed the training process and the importance of discipline placement. The major took extensive notes. He asked if the method could be standardized. Thorne answered honestly. The system could be taught. It could be scaled. But it required soldiers who respected the environment. It required practice. A marker placed carelessly could cost lives. The system rewarded precision, not speed. The major thanked him and left to prepare a report. Despite growing recognition, Thorne avoided any suggestion that the method belonged to him. He insisted that the forest itself provided the solution. He simply listened. In early August, German forces attempted a large-scale movement under heavy fog cover. They planned to reposition several platoons through the same terrain the Americans now controlled. The movement occurred at night. Germans believed the fog would protect them. They did not expect detection. Thorne's marker network revealed their approach long before contact. Detection strips shifted in sequence as the enemy passed. Scouts tracked their movement with near-perfect accuracy. The battalion adjusted its lines. Machine gun teams repositioned. Rifle squads reinforced weak points. Artillery observers corrected their ranges despite the fog. When the Germans advanced, they found American positions ready. The counterattack was devastating. The battalion held the line with minimal losses. After the battle, several officers said the same thing. They had never seen a natural environment turned into such a reliable tactical asset. And they credited one man for making it possible. The fog finally thinned during the second week of August, but the battalion had already mastered the forest. Thorn's glint system had become second nature to the men. They no longer questioned whether a mission was possible when the weather turned against them. They prepared their beams, checked their strips, memorized their codes, and moved into the treeline with the confidence of soldiers who understood the terrain in ways their enemy could not. Although the fog lifted, Thorn continued refining the technique. He explored how sunlight filtered through the canopy at dawn and dusk. He tested how different levels of ambient light affected visibility. He discovered that certain bark types retained their reflective properties in low moonlight if scraped at a sharper angle. Soldiers adapted quickly. They used the method even on nights with partial visibility because it kept them aligned without reliance on noisy communication. In mid-August, a staff officer from division headquarters returned with a formal directive. Higher command wanted a demonstration for several intelligence and reconnaissance officers. They hoped to evaluate whether the technique could be taught to units across other forested sectors. Thorn organized the demonstration with care. He placed markers along a standard reconnaissance trail, included detection points, and created a short branching route to show. Variation. The officers observed as two scouts moved through dense undergrowth using only the glint markers as guides. They navigated the path without hesitation. They identified each reflection at the correct angle. They reported detection shifts along the demonstration line. The officers asked Thorn detailed questions. How long did it take soldiers to learn the method? How quickly could a division implement it? What were the limits in different climates? Thorn answered with the same clarity that had defined his leadership. He explained that cold weather reduced moisture levels and shifted reflectivity. He explained that extremely humid nights required deeper scrapes for consistent glints. He emphasized the need for unit discipline, since poor placement created false signals. The officers took notes and left visibly impressed. They understood they had witnessed something uncommon. A natural method turned into a reliable navigation and detection tool. Despite this interest, Thorn never sought recognition. He spent his evenings helping young soldiers understand tree grain patterns, moisture behavior, and light diffusion. He showed them how to test bark strips using minimal movement. He walked routes with them repeatedly until every man knew how to trust the glint. He believed survival depended on shared skill rather than personal credit. As the battalion prepared for a new phase of operations, Harlow gathered his officers. They reviewed the impact of the glint system. It had reduced friendly fire incidents. It had eliminated lost patrols. It had allowed coordinated movements under fog that would have halted entire companies earlier in the campaign. It had delivered early warnings of enemy infiltration. It had guided medics to wounded men in near-zero visibility. The battalion's effectiveness in forest operations had increased dramatically. Thorn listened quietly as officers praised the method. He nodded only once, acknowledging their appreciation without taking pride in the compliments. For him, the satisfaction came from seeing his men return from missions alive. In late August, during a lull in the fighting, Thorn walked alone along one of the main ridge trails. The fog was thin, just enough to soften the outlines of the trees. He checked several markers. Some had dried and lost their sheen. Others retained their faint glimmer. He removed damaged strips and replaced them with fresh ones. The work was simple. The forest felt calm. The noise of war seemed distant. For a moment, he remembered the forests of the Pacific Northwest where he had spent his youth. Those memories blended with the present. He felt the same quiet weight of responsibility he had carried when guiding logging crews through dangerous terrain. As he worked, a young private approached and asked why Thorn still maintained markers when the fog had thinned. Thorn smiled slightly. He told the private that the forest changed by the hour. Fog could return without warning. Rain could fall. Wind could shift moisture levels. Preparedness saved lives. Waiting for conditions to worsen before acting invited disaster. The private nodded and followed him along the trail, observing how Thorn inspected each strip. That night, a brief storm swept across the forest. Fog returned suddenly. A patrol scheduled to move before dawn relied entirely on the glint system Thorn had refreshed earlier. They reached their objective without difficulty. The young private later told his squad that he now understood why Thorn worked even when conditions seemed safe. As August neared its end, the battalion rotated out of the front line. New units took their place. Several officers asked Thorn to leave written instructions for the incoming troops. He created a detailed field note covering bark selection, strip preparation, angle calibration, moisture management, and beam control. He wrote clearly, avoiding unnecessary language. He described each technique in simple terms. He included diagrams showing the reflective angle and examples of detection patterns. These notes circulated among multiple units. When Thorne's battalion moved into reserve, many soldiers shook his hand. Some thanked him directly. Others simply nodded with quiet respect. They all understood that his knowledge had kept them alive. Harlow told him that his contribution had changed the battalion's approach to forest warfare. Thorne replied that the forest had always provided answers. Someone only needed to learn how to read them. After the war, Thorne returned to the Pacific Northwest. He resumed work in forestry. He spent his days among the same trees he had known since youth. He never spoke loudly about his wartime innovations. He considered them a natural extension of the skills he had honed long before the conflict. A few veterans who had served under him visited years later. They shared stories of the fog-laden nights when they followed faint glints through the forest. They thanked him for giving them a way to survive the invisible dangers of the Ardennes. Thorne accepted their gratitude with the same humility he had shown during the war. He lived quietly, preferring the company of forests and the steady rhythm of seasonal winds. He walked logging trails with the same deliberate pace he had used when placing markers in enemy territory. He watched how light played on bark surfaces in early morning mist and remembered the nights when such glints had saved entire patrols. His method never became a formal part of military doctrine. The war moved on. Technology changed. Yet among the soldiers who served with him, the Glint Test lived on as a story of resourcefulness. They told new recruits decades later that a lumberjack once taught them to navigate fog so thick a man could lose his own shadow. Those who heard the story understood the deeper truth. Innovation did not always come from laboratories or command headquarters. Sometimes it came from a man who knew the language of trees. Thorne remained one of the forgotten innovators. His legacy hid in quiet details. A faint reflection on wet bark. A momentary flash that guided men through danger. A simple idea that saved lives in one of the most unforgiving terrains of the war. His story stood as a testament to what a single soldier could achieve when he combined skill, experience, and the courage to break from doctrine.